It's difficult to think of an idea that's either more timely or more likely to be misunderstood during the year of an election cycle than the idea of the common good. We tend to use this phrase, the common good, quite a lot, and politicians use it an awful lot during campaigns, but very often we use it in quite a loose way, or we suddenly discover that people are using it and really mean quite different things when they use the term. So sometimes politicians, when they're making speeches, will appeal to the idea of the common good as something along the lines of the national economic interest, equated broadly to, say, GDP or national security, etc. Sometimes we use it to mean something along the lines of sacrificing something I might want for myself because there's a greater public benefit if I sacrifice myself for this thing. So I won't go outdoors in a pandemic in order to protect the health and the well-being of others. But it brings with it this notion of a slightly sacrificial sort of thing that we do. So sometimes we use it publicly in that kind of a way. A third way in which people use the phrase the common good in general parlance, in general speech, can be something like it means the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So what we might call in philosophy a kind of majoritarian or utilitarian principle of the common good. What's best for most people, that's what the common good is. Well, I want to suggest in what I'm going to say during the course of this short video that in fact a Catholic social teaching understanding of the common good doesn't really boil down to or equate to any of those three general meanings of the term. It means something, I think, richer, more exciting, and more challenging and demanding. So first of all, to understand how the Catholic tradition approaches the common good, we need to understand that for Catholic social teaching, the common good is not just focused on things that political parties stand for and things that politicians do. In other words, we have a very wide definition of what counts as politics and what it means to be political, and Catholic social teaching deliberately and consciously does not reduce that idea to the state alone, to the functioning of the state or the task of political parties. So the politics of the common good in its widest definition for Catholics includes all the ways in which we relate to each other across differences, the ways that we trade with each other, so our economic and working lives, the ways in which we exchange socially with each other and interact as individuals and communities, the way in which we engage in play, sport and leisure together, and the way in which we generate societies out of common activity. So all of those things are part of the stuff of politics. And so when you see that kind of definition, this much broader understanding of the political space of the common good, you understand that it can't just boil down to what governments, nation states or political parties do. And yet they play a crucial role in establishing the conditions for work, trade, relationships, leisure, and common pursuits. So it's the sum total of how all of those elements together enable us to build a social life, a common life, that Catholic social teaching is interested in. And the second thing to emphasise there then is that Catholics do have and bring to the table, if you like, a very particular understanding of politics. So for Catholics, politics is part of the world and the life that we were created for in goodness. So politics is not something which is just a consequence of us being sort of fallen, nasty creatures with short lives. That's not how Catholic social teaching or the biblical tradition sees politics. Rather, politics is part of how we negotiate the life of community, how we work out a just distribution of goods, how we work out the rules of how we want to get along with each other, and how we want to create something in common that's lasting and has a benefit through generations. The common good is about the interaction of your workplace, your education environment, the sports and leisure pursuits that you're part of, the outreach and volunteering work that you do with those in need, as well as the work of government, its agencies, its political parties and actors. All of that together constitutes, if you like, the world of the common good. And the reality is that we're being called to this question of what are the conditions of social life that you think enable individuals, but also groups, to more fully reach their own perfection, the excellence that they're hardwired for. So that invites us, in essence, into a conversation. It's a bit like that definition is a starting point for a massive social conversation. What are the conditions that enable work, education, leisure, family life, and so forth to be part of human beings reaching their natural purpose, reaching towards their perfection and their fulfillment and their flourishing? So we need to talk about those social conditions as part of any debate in society. So the common good then can be summarised in the Catholic social teaching tradition in the following quick 10 ways. Number one, first of all, the common good is a natural horizon for human thinking. It's not an artificial thing to talk about, and it's vital, it's essential that we talk about the common good as part of our public discussions. We're creatures who are naturally social, and we want to talk about our social purpose. Secondly, the common good in the Catholic tradition is the basis for law and political community. There is no other purpose or basis for law and political community than serving the common good. So it's the kind of end goal of politics. So that's why we have to talk about it. But it's not politics reduced to the state alone. Thirdly, and this is the bit that really interests me, I suppose, we're created as interdependent creatures from our birth to our natural death, through our education, our work lives, our health lives. We're interdependent with other people. We can never achieve the goods that we most value in life alone. So forming relationships that last, giving birth to a new generation, being productive in arts and culture, whatever it is that we might labour for in our lives, inevitably, those highest goods that we pursue, the things that we most have as regrets if we don't do them on our deathbed, reaching those goods and achieving them requires us to cooperate with other people. And when we look at those goods, we see very quickly that they are reliant on a kind of common good framework for their flourishing and their achievement. So all the most significant goods that we long for in our lives require cooperation, common endeavour, and the protection of other certain kinds of wider social goods in order to achieve. So the common good is therefore, for Catholics, a kind of participatory idea that's rooted in seeking what I would call healthy interdependence. Not unhealthy dependence, that doesn't help the common good at all, but healthy interdependence. That's what we're kind of wired for socially. So that means that common goods, this is the fourth point, are more than just the addition of individual goods. So I have clean water, I have clean air, I have access to meaningful work. The common good is more than simply the sum total of adding together those goods. And most importantly, the common good, unlike some other forms of goods, the common good can never be exhausted and it can't be depleted by being used up. By focusing on the common good and striving for it, you can only ever actually achieve more of it, because it's not a sort of consumable entity that gets exhausted. Through its pursuit, in fact, we increase it. We increase the overall possibility of it. Equally, I think one of the things that the Catholic social teaching tradition helps us to see is that we're meant to focus on the positive things that enable us to reach for the common good, but also to be aware, particularly in politics, of the conditions that frustrate or deplete or denude the common good. So anything that threatens the human dignity of the individual, that sees certain lives as expendable, anything which depletes human agency, so the importance of being able to take responsibility with others in social interdependence for our common life. Where those conditions are denuded, then there is a kind of threat to the conditions of the common good that we might want to be aware of. So this is my sixth point. Systems that denude nature or reduce the dignity of the individual are not truly orientated towards true common goods. So, for example, to illustrate, countries might achieve a very high GDP, but they might also be countries that are really not very good at looking after their elderly. which are hostile to the possibility of admitting migrants who might have a call upon the life and safety and protection of that community. They might be societies which are hostile to those with disabilities. They might see some lives as deeply expendable. They might have very high levels of emission that are problematic from an environmental perspective. So high GDP, but you would argue they have common good problems. So we're called to see that there needs to be a kind of balance in the kind of goods that we pursue. So that responsibility, point 7, the responsibility for the common good, remains always for Catholics personal as well as structural. So we can't simply contract out responsibility for the common good to the person we elect in a general election or a local election. We have a personal responsibility to pursue that ourselves, as well as to seek it from those who represent us politically. And we need that to be hardwired into the systems and structures of the institutions and the movements and the organisations that we're part of, and our legal system as well. So it's irreducibly personal and it's also structural. For that reason, point 8, the common good can only be achieved where you don't deny the agency, the participation, or the contribution either of particular individuals or particular groups. So if you value the contributions of particular groups on the basis of racial identity, religious identity, class identity, then that in itself is a threat to the common good. So where you deny the role, the agency, the participation, or the contribution of a particular individual or group, that threatens the common good, and that needs to be rebalanced. And then the 9th point, which is slightly different but relates to point 8, is that you might have a society that's very, very good at pursuing education, that's very good at pursuing economic development and innovation, might even be good at environmental protection, but it denies religious freedom. It denies the education of girls. It denies vaccines and healthcare to a particular sector. It denies freedom of association. So you could think of a particular dimension of the good which that society doesn't recognise or value. That then also becomes a threat to the common good and something to be challenged. And then point 10, a Catholic understanding of the common good insists that our social relationships with each other and even our politics can never be merely transactional. All the most important things in our lives are relational, and a relational culture needs to be hardwired into any system that in the end will produce justice. A Catholic social teaching understanding of the common good insists that we begin not with a question of what's good for most people, but we measure the common good according to the needs and the situation of the most socially marginalised, the most socially vulnerable, the most excluded, and those lives that are seen as most superfluous. The common good is no more good than the good of the least of those individuals, as it were, in terms of questions of social worth. So it brings those questions of dignity, solidarity, of care for creation, of the preferential option for the poor, and the maintenance of agency and power in people's lives, the principle of subsidiarity. It brings those as a rich kaleidoscope of principles that help us to have that conversation about the common good in the richest way that we possibly can. So that's a conversation that can be had in any community at any time. It's not an abstract conversation that belongs in Westminster or belongs in Brussels or belongs in the UN. It belongs in the context of your family, your neighbourhood, your school, your business or workplace,